At its heart, R2P is a very simple idea. Its core idea, of course, is that all governments have an obligation to protect their civilians from genocide, from war crimes, from crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing. And it's primarily, in that sense, as Hardeep mentions in his book and is mentioned here today, a preventive doctrine. However, it also acknowledges that we live in an imperfect world, and if a state is manifestly failing to meet those responsibilities, the international community is obligated to act. And I want to underline this point. It is not a right to intervene, but a responsibility to protect. And I think the difference is an incredibly important one. And in this sense, I think R2P is also a demand-driven norm. That is to say, it wasn't created because diplomats like the ones in the room here today were bored and wanted to create another abbreviation to be used in UN documents. It was created because we live in a world, unfortunately, where mass atrocity exists, and the international community has to respond. So this question of how to respond and how to respond adequately, unfortunately, has not left us. In that context, let me say a couple of brief words about Libya. I still believe that protecting civilians in Benghazi and Misrata was the right thing to do. However, as the bombs fell, I think there were two huge mistakes that were made by the interveners. And one of these is Hardeep goes into enormous detail about, and again, it's very much worth reading from his views from inside the council. The shift from civilian protection to regime change and war fighting, taking sides in a civil war, was an enormous mistake which has not been fully recognized. And I think the second mistake was the withdrawal afterwards. The international community wanted out of Libya very quickly. The Libyans, including the warlords who were vying for power, wanted them out very quickly, and I think it led or contributed significantly to the descent into chaos. And on that latter point, that was actually made very recently by the Libyan ambassador himself at a UN dialogue that I was at. On Syria, I've written at length and spoken anywhere and everywhere people will have me about how I think the UN Security Council's failure to uphold its responsibility to protect the people of Syria is probably the single greatest diplomatic failure of our times. And the judgment of history, I think, will be harsh and will be unforgiving in this regard. All sides in Syria have committed atrocities. There has been complete impunity for that, and the 4 double vetoes of Russia and China have enabled the crimes of the regime, which only outstrip those of ISIS and some of the other armed groups simply because the government has greater weapons of killing at its disposal. And I think we're seeing a culmination of that this week. I believe Aleppo will be, for this generation of world leaders and the UN Security Council members, their Srebrenica or Rwanda moment. What will they do? And I think Syria reveals just how deeply we need UN Security Council reform, an issue I know that is close to the hearts of a number of the speakers. I think, I'm trying to head towards a conclusion here, I think the fundamental challenge of our times is this. There are currently 65 million people in the world displaced by conflict, atrocities, and persecution, the greatest number we have had since the Second World War. And confronting that crisis is an international system that is worn out and is fraying at the edges. We have basically a 20th century UN trying to cope with 21st century problems. In an iPhone world, we kind of have an old crank up, pick up the receiver kind of telephone. And so where does that leave us? I think the norms that protect our fundamental human rights and bind our international community together, they do not live and they do not die in isolation. They are absolutely interlocking and they are mutually reinforcing. And I think the Security Council is struggling to cope in a climate of non-compliance with its resolutions and almost routine violations of the foundations of international law.